Ontario is now an explain or comply jurisdiction. That is, ensure you have women on your corporate boards or tell the Ontario Securities Commission why you do not. Jennifer Reynolds is CEO of Women in Capital Markets, and she joins us now to tell us what's keeping women out of these positions and what can be done to fix that. Jennifer, good to meet you and nice to have you here at TVO.
Thank you.
Let's put some stats up first of all. This is from the Ontario Securities Commission's report from September of 2015. And they found at the OSC that about half of the 722 TSX companies had no women on their boards, zero. And 40% had none in an executive position. This is the first report the TSX companies have done since they became obligated to disclose those numbers. And I guess I wonder, for starters, is this kind of what you expected?
Honestly, it was worse than I expected.
Worse?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's shocking when you just put it in front of people. That transparency, that disclosure is shocking. I mean, a further 30% of boards only have one woman. So it is, I think it's quite shocking. And I think people in Canada actually would be surprised to know that we rank globally very poorly when it comes to gender diversity in leadership. And I think we think of ourselves as a very diverse, inclusive culture here in Canada.
Well, we are. Except?
Not in corporate Canada.
Not in corporate Canada.
Not in the boardroom.
The new rules, which basically, quote unquote, say comply or explain. Explain what that means.
Basically, they're asking, do you have a policy around encouraging gender diversity in leadership on your board, in the executive suite as well? If you don't have that, why do you not have it? What is your explanation for that? And so unfortunately what happened is only 14% of companies actually have a policy, a written policy around gender diversity in the boardroom, and the rest of them didn't. So very few actually have a written policy today in Canada.
And is the idea that the more this is publicized, the more companies will feel embarrassed to do something about it?
Exactly what it is.
Shame them.
Yeah, it's transparency, right? You put the numbers out there. And we saw actually in the UK, they used a similar regime, comply or explain there, and started it back in 2012. Their numbers were very poor. They had about 12.5% of their board seats were filled by women at that point. They put it out there, but they also had behind it an annual report, the Lord Davies report it was called. And so it was a report on how are we doing. And at the back, there was a list of exactly where everybody stood in terms of the companies and how many women they had on their boards. And so now today, they're up over 25%. So they met their goal of where they wanted to be at this point at the end of 2015. So I think it can work, but I think you do have to have a bit of that shame, and you're doing nothing about this and you have zero women. And
there's no doubt in your mind that the reason they got from where they were to where they are is because of this?
I think there was a few different things going on there. There was the regulations, certainly. People all of a sudden had to report on this. And then also there was this Lord Davies report that was pushing people. There was a group of chairs and directors that were put together by a thing called the 30% Club, which aspirationally people signed on, these directors and chairs, saying we want to get to 30% over 5 years. So there was a whole movement on various fronts to push this forward, which in Canada, I think today, we do have the 30% here, it just launched, but we don't have a lot of the push that we saw in the UK yet behind the disclosure requirements.
What is the explanation that corporate Canada gives for why the numbers of women represented on their boards is so bad?
It's pretty embarrassing, actually. Those that didn't have policies said that they only appoint on merit. So what those companies are saying is that they couldn't find one woman for 50% of the boards in this country who merited a board seat. So, that's a red herring. Clearly, there are lots of women who merit these board seats. They're just not looking.
What's really going on then?
Well, I mean, the way it works in the corporate world, certainly at the board level, is that people appoint people they know. They appoint people they're already on boards with. They appoint people from their network. And if you're a 60, 70-year-old man, chances are you know a lot of 60 or 70-year-old men, and those are the people that end up getting on boards. There isn't really real robust processes around board appointments, unfortunately. And so that's another thing that hopefully this will bring about. It forces boards to actually look outside their network and actually say, if I go to a recruiter, if I go outside of my own network, are there qualified women? And they're finding, yes, there are.
Is there any indication that the clients of people who do business with these companies, that they care at all about the composition of the boards of the companies they're dealing with?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because if the clients cared and if the institutional investors all of a sudden were up in arms and saying to boards, you need more women on there, then we know we would get much faster action. The reality is that, certainly if you're talking about these companies, typically they're run, their C-suite is largely filled with men, because it's not just a board issue, it's a C-suite problem we have in terms of representation of women. So I don't think there's enough of a push, and I think we need that push from senior leadership to, if they're hiring some investment bankers or if they're hiring some lawyers, do they look at them and they say, well, what's the gender diversity like in your team and at your firm? And that needs to matter to companies out there.
C-suite meaning chief executive officer, chief financial officer,
exactly,
chief information
sort of
officer,
named
all these
executives.
Right.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
When women are on boards or in positions of authority, what kinds of positions do they tend to hold?
That's an excellent point, because what happens is we are seeing some women move into, very slowly, into executive roles, but where we're seeing them is in support roles. So things like the head of legal, head of HR, areas which, yes, those are fantastic areas and great areas of expertise, but they generally don't lead to the CEO role. And in Canada today, we only have, depending on what you look at, if you look at the FP 500, there's only 5% of CEO chairs are filled by women, unfortunately. So we need to see women not only making it to the C-suite, but also making it into those key profit and loss roles, which do end up, those people end up in the CEO chair.
I used to hear, when you make the comparison to politics, I used to hear pushback from the private sector saying, well, look at your cabinets. Your cabinets have no better female representation than our boards do, so who are you to lecture us on what to do? Except that, last I heard, it's now 2016, and the federal cabinet's 50-50. The Ontario cabinet, not really, but the federal cabinet is. Does that set any example that you think is inspiring at all to corporate Canada?
I think it does, because I think it says that as Canadians, this is a priority for us. And so hopefully, if Canadians feel that's important, hopefully the leaders in corporate Canada start to say, you know what, this is important to people, and I need to care about this. And so I think we're at the beginning of that. I think you've seen some senior leaders step up and take leadership roles in this front, but we need more. And the reality is we've seen it from the largest companies. So the TSX 60 are the ones where you're seeing the fastest uptake on really making progress on gender diversity on their boards. But as you know, in Canada, almost 75% of our publicly traded companies have market caps less than $1 billion. So they're smaller companies, heavily resource oriented, which tend to have worse numbers than the rest of the companies out there. So it's in those areas, we need to really see it permeate all those other companies, not just those big ones at the top.
If there's no impact on the bottom line, though, is there any expectation that anything's going to change?
Well, this is the whole rationale, is there's been study after study after study that show that there is an impact on the bottom line. So, very credible folks like Credit Suisse and McKinsey and others have put forward, done the research, looked at it globally, looked at it across sector, and it shows that those companies that have higher proportion of women in leadership have higher share price performance and higher profitability.
I didn't mean that, though. That's downstream. I'm talking upstream. I'm saying if there's no, with an absence of women in the boardroom before, and clients thinking to themselves, well, I'm happy, things are fine,
right,
and no pressure from that end of things, should anybody expect anything to change?
Well, I think companies, smart companies, are going to realize, they're going to look at that research and say, you know what, I want to be more competitive. And in order to be more competitive, this is going to give me an edge. And so they have to buy into that business case, right? And say that I'm going to do this for the bottom line. And in Canada's economy, the reality is, in terms of productivity, we're not doing so well relative to many other developed countries. And we do need to focus on this. So we need to maximize our talent pool. When you think about, if the leadership doesn't include women, we've now said 50% of our university graduates, now 62% today actually, who are women, we're not using that talent to its fullest extent. So as a company, as a country, that just doesn't make sense.
Here's cultural critic September Anderson writing in the Globe and Mail. I see you nodding your head already. You know where this is going. Here she is in the Globe. This is the problem with feminism as it exists today. Black women and other women of color are continuously rendered invisible beneath the quote-unquote women banner. The default definition for women is white women, those with the most systemic power, and the issues of the most privileged of us take precedence over the trials and tribulations of the least privileged of us. In Canada, black women and other women of color find themselves missing not only from movements for gender diversity, but also from seats of power. Bank boards, newsrooms, hospital boards, and executive positions are all spaces where white women see themselves better represented. When companies have women on the board, it's pretty much white women we're talking about, isn't it?
That's what we're seeing. If you look at visible minorities, just men and women, in the FP 500 today, it's at 7%, and that's actually up. It's up from 2% last year. So it's self-reported minorities.
Went from 2 to 7 in 1 year?
Yeah, so it's improved.
Yeah.
I think that's a function of people starting to have more robust processes and think about diversity. But certainly, yes, diversity in many shapes and forms in the boardroom is a big problem. And it is more complex. I mean, you have an issue, first there's gender and race factors into it. And absolutely, it's more complex a problem when you add that in to the whole equation.
Anything going on to try to address that added issue?
Well, I mean, I think that hopefully if you start focusing on women as a whole, the good work that you do, the robust processes that you put in place are going to cause people to ask questions and cause people to dig even further, and not just, we can't just have a small group of women on all the boards rotating around, right? We need to look at the pool more broadly. And I think if you think about Canada, and I spent a lot of time in universities talking to young women about careers and trying to inspire them hopefully to go into careers in business and in the financial industry in particular. And if you go into a university today, it's diverse. I mean, the diversity is unbelievable. And so when you think that our boardrooms don't reflect that, not just in gender, but just in terms of culture and ethnicity, that's a fundamental problem in our country. I mean, you can't continue to have one sliver of the population represented at the top and then be churning out all these university graduates who are very, very different looking than the people at the top. And so I think we need to address this as a country. I think it's very important to use the talent pool.
Let's circle back to something we were talking about a few moments ago when we talked to, you mentioned that the feedback that you frequently get is that they can't find anybody meritorious enough to sit on the boards. Yeah. Let me tell you another piece of feedback that I hear, and you tell me whether or not this rings true at all to you. Women, as you point out, the majority coming out of universities these days, get onto a career track, but then may want to have a family. If they step out of the, out of the workplace for however many years, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in order to have kids, they're already too far behind to catch up to be considered for those positions in the C-suite, as you put it, or on boards.
Yeah.
Does that ring true at all?
Absolutely. It's actually a huge problem because the way that typically corporate Canada has functioned is that you get on the treadmill and you keep going and you don't get off. And if you get off, it's very, very difficult to get back on. And to your point, just when sort of that next crop of leadership talent is being evaluated, when they're sort of 30 to 35, when the young leaders are being picked out, when they're being sponsored, when they're being sort of brought along up the track
mentored,
to make it to
their eyes on them.
Exactly. That talent development is happening. Women tend to be having children. And so they do fall off the track. And so it takes a very intentional talent management program to recognize that and to say, if someone does take some time off or have children, how are we going to make sure that there are ways for them to get back on the track? We actually have a program that we run called Return to Bay Street, where we bring women who have taken some time off and we bring them back into the industry in senior roles. We don't say, hey, would you like to start again at the bottom and try again? It's bringing them back into roles where we're using that experience. So our industry actually has recognized, starting to think creatively about how do you fix that problem. But that's a critical problem.
How's that actually going, that program?
Fantastic, actually. We've had, of all the women who have gone through over the last 4 years, they've all translated that into longer term roles in the industry. So it works, and it's been phenomenally successful for those institutions.
At the end of the day, though, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. At the end of the day, there are very few 50-50 relationships in this world, right? Women disproportionately bear the family responsibilities compared to men. And if they take themselves out of the career track for a period of time in order to have kids, and that's not going to change, is that where we're at? Is there just nothing we can do about this? Not enough we can do about this?
Oh, I mean, I think this is about not just cultural change in the workplace, but socially, to your point. Women are expected. I mean, typically nobody asks a guy if he's going to take paternity leave or if he feels guilty about going back to work once he has a young child.
Exactly.
So they ask women those questions. That's right. So there's a social issue, but there's also a business issue around the culture in the workplace. So we do need to address that. The reality is the vast majority of Canadian families are dual income. And so having women in the workplace is very important to Canadian families today. And making workplaces an area where they can excel and thrive as well is important. But you've got to have at home, the other side of the coin is you've got to have a more 50-50 relationship at home. And we also, one important thing too, in terms of the work environment, you have to make it okay for a man to say, I'm leaving early today, I'm going to take my kids to soccer practice.
Without him feeling guilty.
Exactly. There can't be a stigma against men, which there is today to a great degree. I'm not going to speak for every company, but generally, I think there's still a stigma. There's a stigma against men taking paternity leave too. That is critical to us fixing. If we can't fix the other side of the equation, i.e. women and the challenges we face in the workplace with, in terms of children and those years, if we don't fix it for men.
Okay, so the provincial government is now sort of in the naming and shaming business as it relates to this. Should it do more? Should it actually pass a law saying you are obliged by law to have, pick a number, 10, 15, 20%, maybe a sliding scale going up, of female board members, or else?
Well, is that a quota you're suggesting, I guess? It's, the quota, what is the teeth behind the quota? I think we do need to amp the pressure up, for sure. I think that the government needs to be very clear that this is an important issue and they want to see progress on that. And I think through Comply or Explain, you can continue to apply pressure and increase the transparency that you're asking of these companies. I'm not a fan of quotas. We've seen them, though, very broadly used in terms of the board issue in Europe. That it's been used, it's been successful in many, many countries at moving the numbers up on the board.
So if it works there, why not here?
Well, my question is that unfortunately it doesn't translate into changing culture in the actual company, i.e. the C-suite, the executive roles haven't all of a sudden become more populated by women, which we would hope to see. So I think you do need to have an actual cultural change in the boardroom to say everyone in the boardroom is buying in and believes in it. And with quotas, it's harder to get that, I think.
So does government policy need to change at all on this front?
I think that we need to, as I said, we're a year into Comply or Explain. Were the results great? No. I think we need to see a lot more progress there. I think that there needs to be pressure on senior leaders in our economy to do something. And I think it needs to become quite embarrassing for them not to do it. So, we we need to get engaged, all of us, in terms of being aware of this issue and speaking about it and putting it in the public eye so that people know how bad our numbers are relative to other countries in the world. And I think the government can do that as well by just keeping at it in terms of putting the pressure on. I don't think it's very hard to sort of regulate out bias. It's a cultural change we're after, and regulation I don't think would be the most effective way to do that right now.
Let the naming and shaming continue.
Exactly.
Jennifer Reynolds, Women in Capital Markets. Good of you to visit us at TVO tonight.
Thanks
very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.